this week was a moment to say, this is half time. Are we going to do better in the second half? And are we committed to working together on this? And I think the first signal coming out of New York is an unequivocal yes. Now, what is also clear is that we need to address some fundamental challenges: financing, debt problems, the ability to invest in each other's ability to recover. Many of the least developed countries are unable to borrow any more money on the capital markets right now. Interest rates are too high. And even worse, the average lower middle income country or least developed country is spending 1.4 times more on servicing their debt interest than on their own education sector. This is not sustainable, neither in terms of national development nor economically nor politically ultimately. And so we do need to recognize that there is an urgent need to solve this problem of financing, which is really the major constraint right now. Debt, liquidity in particularly the developing world, and also the cost of capital. That's why the Secretary General has proposed an SDG stimulus plan. And this is a framework around which countries can come together to help each other out of this crisis, and also have a recovery where poor countries are not locked down in financial and economic constraints, and the wealthier countries can buy their way out of these crises and recover very quickly. This is the moment in which we have to confront that. And I believe that there is no miracle cure right now, but we know what needs to be done. And perhaps we always need to remind ourselves the world has collectively enough wealth to basically implement the SDGs even by 2030. But it is not flowing where it needs to. It is not accessible to those who need it the most. But above all, let's not forget that the targets in terms of timelines and indicators were ways in which we were to pace ourselves. The 17 Sustainable Development Goals are a framework for cooperation. They acknowledge that we are interdependent as countries. Even if we don't like each other, we depend on each other. And that has to be the idea that always must come first ultimately, because without that, we are condemning the next generation to an irreversible climate change. The next pandemic could be even more catastrophic, and poverty will continue to grow rather than decline.
Are you optimistic moving forward with this renewed commitment that we can get there in 7 years? With so many countries, as you mentioned, still hurting from the pandemic and not knowing when the recovery will end?
Look, the easier way to answer is not everyone, everywhere, and at once. I think 7 years is going to be tough for some countries. But what we also learned in the 95 countries that UNDP prepared these SDG Insight reports for is that we have seen very different pathways and outcomes to different policy choices. And we don't have time now to go into the details, but in some countries poverty actually didn't go up. It went down despite the pandemic, because some of the measures that were taken during the pandemic, temporary basic incomes, strengthening social safety nets, knowing who are the most vulnerable in your community so you can actually help them in that critical phase, allow you to go through a nightmare of a pandemic, but actually a year or two later come out with a better poverty focus in terms of who needs support, who needs social safety nets. Let me also give you one more figure, which I think is an interesting one. When we adopted the SDGs in the year 2015, the number of people who had access to the internet was roughly about 3.2 billion people. At the end of 2022, the world had 5.3 billion people accessing the internet. So we added 2 billion people to having access to a technology that is fundamental to their own livelihoods, to the way that societies will function, that e-government platforms will operate. And that is also a success, despite the pandemic, despite the economic setbacks. Let's celebrate those moments also, because they didn't happen by accident. Governments invested in digital infrastructure. The providers and the companies created platforms that were, in a sense, so attractive to people that they could earn a livelihood on it, or they could access health services. So we've had a tremendous success story in the digital domain, just like we're seeing that happen with renewable energy now. We have record levels of investments globally in clean renewable energy infrastructure happening for 4 years running now. So the energy revolution towards a net zero carbon future is actually happening, and it's growing exponentially. So just two facts to, in a sense, counter those who say, you know, we have had many setbacks, therefore we should not try anymore. It's not an option. We have to move forward, and we have to, in that sense, be hopeful that we can do things differently in the future. And the examples I've given you prove that different choices produce different results.